Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ARP 2021 symposium. My name is Syed. For those who do not know me, Moin is just like coin with an M, and Syed like psychology educator, Syed. Very happy to be with you here today. As you can see, there's an OSF link on the front page that will take you to some information and materials, these slides, and other things associated with this talk. And before I share my thoughts with you about how we can diversify, how we think about diversity in personality research, I want to say a little bit about the nature of the broader symposium that this talk is a part of. So last November, I believe it was, I gave a talk at UC Riverside titled "Where Are Race, Ethnicity, and Culture in Personality Research?" And I ended up writing up kind of a brief version of that talk and submitting that for publication. It's currently under review at Personality Science. There's a link there if you're interested in reading that talk. It's very short. And the presentation and the paper were really inspired by Ray Carlson's classic paper, Where is the Person in Personality Research? And as many of you, I'm sure, know, in that paper, Carlson talked about a number of issues, but a lot of it had to do with methodological issues and areas of focus that we had sort of, that personality psychology had kind of lost the focus on the actual person, both in terms of the subject and in terms of the interpersonal dynamics of the research context. But also a substantial portion of that article is about who was included as our samples, sort of the over-reliance on college students. Now, she didn't get deep into issues of race, ethnicity, and culture, but focused kind of on the fact that it's the focus is on a limited slice of the population. So my talk and preprint really sort of built upon that idea that if we look across personality research across several decades, and there's been so many advances in so many ways, we still see some pretty major limitations in terms of really engaging with race, ethnicity, and culture, not only in terms of sort of their categorical nature, in terms of generalizability, but really thinking substantively about what those concepts mean and what they mean for personality. So when I was asked to spearhead this symposium, I was toying around with a few different ideas, and I thought, well, maybe it'd be interesting to sort of to gather some people together and see, you know, what do they think about some of these ideas? And so this paper was was meant to be kind of the source material or inspiration for the subsequent talks. And that was largely just to kind of make sure there was some cohesion around the ideas and that we were all kind of talking about the same general kinds of things. I asked the presenters to expand upon, contradict, whatever, however they wanted to react to any of the ideas. Could be the broad ideas, could be specific ideas. And so the ultimate product was 4 talks, mine included, but 3 others by Monisha Pashupathy, Jordan Booker, and Radhika Damian, all sort of taking different angles on this issue of where are race, ethnicity, and culture and personality research. And as you'll see, they really are a nice collection that together provide, say, hopefully some new ways, at least 1 or 2 new ways that you all in the audience can think about these issues and hopefully lead to some actionable steps about, well, how can we actually progress as a field and as individual researchers? Now, my own talk is not going to be a full rehash of that prior talk and paper, but rather I wanted to really emphasize 3 specific points. So I'll talk about these 3 considerations. All of these are covered somewhat in the paper, but I wanted to elaborate on them a little bit or talk about them in a slightly different way. So first is to stop equating personality with traits. That we shouldn't conflate international and domestic diversity, and finally, that we need to move from proxies to processes. So I'll briefly talk about what each of these means in turn, and we'll go from there. So this first one, personalities, that personality equals traits. I know this is a common complaint. I complain about it all the time. Everyone complains about it all the time. And yet it persists, the idea that personality itself can be totally understood through understanding patterns of traits, profiles of traits, however you want to think about traits, that these relatively stable dimensions of individual differences are the core way in which we understand personality. And we know that's not the case. Everybody knows that's not the case, but we often act as if it is the case. And I think it's really important that we all try to get that out of our system and try to stop treating personality and traits as one and the same. That's not a new idea. Plenty of people have talked about that. But I will argue here that it has strong relevance for understanding personality from a cultural perspective. So this is a quote from McAdams and Powell's about how to think about personality more broadly. Builds upon the work that McAdams had been doing for years prior to this paper about really conceptualizing personality at multiple levels. Now, this is a big quote with lots of words, but if we can pick out a few components here, right? And essentially there's 5 pieces here that are really critical for understanding personality. And if we look at them schematically instead, we can see them here, that personality essentially consists of 3 components: traits, characteristic adaptations, and life narratives. You can think of these as levels, or aspects, components, call them whatever you want. They're different ways of understanding personality and different the manifestations of personality. And then that all 3 of these levels occur within a broader biological evolutionary context and a broader cultural and social context. So this, you can see traits are here, but traits are clearly a very specific aspect component of personality, and that there's much more to it. To my understanding and talking with people, this is not controversial at all. Pretty much any personality psychologist agrees with this general way of thinking. They might not agree with the specifics, but generally speaking, that we can think of personality at multiple levels, and that we must consider both biological and cultural components of personality. Now, I have these as separable components, which you'll see from Monisha's talk. She doesn't like that, that there's just sort of different boxes. And it's true, these are sort of artificial separations. For example, my colleague Colin DeYoung has argued that characteristic adaptations and life narratives are not really separable, that they can be collapsed into one domain. Whatever, you can think of these as all being intermixed and interrelated with one another. Is not necessarily easily parsed dimensions, but just a broader way of thinking about personality. That said, I also find you can kind of line them up in this way by moving biology and culture onto either side of the personality components. Now, remember, biology and culture are not part of personality. They're more the context in which personality sort of exists and is manifest. But by putting them and arranging them in this kind of framework, we can better understand how the different aspects of personality are related to one another. Essentially, these are, when we put them in a line like this, how proximal they are is an indicator of how related they are. So on the biological side, you see traits are going to have a stronger biological component than our characteristic adaptations or life narratives. And then life narratives are going to have a stronger cultural component than our characteristic adaptations or traits. CAs then are in the middle, in which you have both stronger biological and a cultural component to them. Now, all have biology and culture. It's just a matter of weighting them. And so when we look at them sort of in this proximal way, we start to see that those relations. That's quite helpful to think about, especially when thinking about the role of culture and personality. There are plenty of studies on cross-cultural and indigenous approaches to personality, mostly personality traits, although not exclusively. But the vast majority of this work kind of looks like this, where traits are examined in relation to some cultural pattern. Usually it's just nation. So looking at different national profiles of traits or mean levels or correlates or taxonomies or structures or whatever, and comparing those across multiple different contexts. And so what you're seeing here is kind of a skipping over of the most proximal cultural natures of personality and going direct to traits. What that means is you're likely going to be missing some core information, some core details and understandings about how culture and cultural processes are related to the expression and implications of traits. In contrast, what we should be seeing is something more like this, where if we're seeking to understand the cultural nature of traits, that we are also looking at life narratives and or characteristic adaptations. Those are the more sort of explanatory components to understand how there might be cultural variations or similarities in traits. So this goes back to my point that if we broaden, we need to broaden the way we talk about personality as not just traits, not just because that's just a fact that that's the case, but also as we start to think more about these other levels of personality that have gotten less attention or have not been integrated as well, I should say, with the trait literatures. As we think more about those levels, we will gain a deeper cultural understanding of traits, not and as well as these other levels. Okay, consideration number 2. This is a relatively brief one, or so I often say. We'll see what happens. International and domestic diversity are distinct. This seems like this should be pretty obvious, but from what I see in discussions and the research, it's often not as obvious, or at least not properly recognized, understood, and built into our understanding. There is plenty, as I said, of international research on personality. Personality has been studied in dozens, hundreds of different cultural contexts. We know quite a bit. Not that we don't have a lot of agreement about the nature of personality across many different national contexts, but there is a good amount of research that goes beyond standards for US and Western Europe work. That aside, the work is rather limited in terms of domestic diversity. So looking at the non-dominant populations within countries. So even looking within the US, where there's just a ridiculous amount of personality research, there's very, very little that's looking at diversity within minority populations, be it by race, ethnicity, gender diversity, social class, immigration. You know, it exists, it's out there. I'm not saying it doesn't exist at all, but there's relatively little focus on that. So as we tout sort of thinking about that, yes, personality research is quite strong in terms of looking at diversity, and you point to international studies, that's good and that's important, and we should continue to do that work. But we can't substitute that for the lack or for domestic diversity, that we need to think about the variations within cultural contexts, not just between cultural contexts. And of course, I have to bring this up because everyone who knows me at all knows that I'll always do it, that one of the concepts that really hampers our ability to understand the diversity at both and how international and domestic contexts intersect is the WEIRD acronym: Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. I'll keep this brief because I wrote a blog post here that articulated my complaints about WEIRD. But in my view, this acronym really does more harm than good. It really constrains our understanding of diversity because it's just extremely vague in terms of who it applies to. And what's really sort of surprising about the discussion of WEIRD in the original paper and subsequently is there's just no discussion about race or ethnicity. There's no discussion about the sort of within country variation. Really, the focus is on that between country variation. So if we're really focusing on this idea of WEIRD, it's conflating these international and domestic diversity issues. And we need to pull those apart so that we're clearer about who we're including in our work and to whom our work applies. Okay, last one. We need to focus on processes and not proxies. Give a classic example here. Most of you have read or at least know about this paper by Marcus and Kitayama on culture and the self, in which they summarized a huge amount of research suggesting that cultural patterns that have been observed, variations around cognition, emotion, and motivation, can largely be explained by differences, cultural differences in self-construal. So a relatively independent self-construal versus interdependent self-construal. So the way in which people in different cultural contexts kind of construct and understand the selves, and how that implicates all these other aspects of their psychology. There's this wonderful paper by David Matsumoto. If you have not read this paper, I consider this to be an absolute must read. Stop what you're doing, pause this talk. I'm boring you by now anyway, and go read this paper because it's absolute must. It was written in 1999. You could put the year 2021 on it and every point would pretty much still stand. What Matsumoto highlighted is that the underlying model of Marcus and Katayama is that cultural values, attitudes, behaviors, norms, what have you, lead to variations in psychological processes. And it does so via this mechanism of variations in self-controls, right? So this is the model, is what most people have in their heads when they think about the Marcus and Katayama work, or even more broadly work about individualism and collectivism, that this is the model. What Matsumoto did is actually looked at the evidence in the original paper from 1991 and subsequent evidence to see how much evidence actually examined this model. And the conclusion was none, that all of the evidence was not to their model. It was, in fact, country differences, not even culture, so not getting into the cultural values, attitudes, and so on, country differences, patterns of country differences on cognition, emotion, and motivation. So self-construals themselves rarely measured, cultural rarely measured. We're just talking about national country level differences on cognition, emotion, and motivation. So, and this continues to be the case today. Every time I see a paper on this topic and I open it up, 9 times out of 10, there's no measurement of culture and there's no measurement of self-control. Not always the case, but the vast majority of research continues to look like this. So in this case, country, right, is serving as a proxy for a whole bunch of stuff, both in the culture component and in the self-control component. So instead of measuring and examining those processes, we're just focusing on the proxies. The problem is, without measuring culture or the mechanisms of self-control, we have literally no way to know that our interpretation of the data is correct. It could be for literally any reason why we might see cross-national differences in any outcome. But we often will just project our own preferred way of thinking about it and succumb to our own preconceived biases and notions and stereotypes about how cultures are or ought to be. And that's really problematic. Just to take this point one step further, if we look at personality traits, and we were interested in looking at Black, Latino, and white Americans and how they differ in mean levels of personality traits, we can do that analysis. And if we find any variations, again, we have no idea why those variations exist. They could be for any possible reason, but we can interpret that. Nothing stops us from interpreting that. We do. And so those interpretations really can vary quite a lot. And I've written about that more extensively elsewhere. I won't go into details about that. But there can be more or less charitable interpretations. It really is just open to whatever direction the researcher wants to take the findings. Instead, what we should be thinking about is, well, if we see these group differences, what might be the mechanism that might explain them? The groups themselves are never the explanation. The groups, these are just broad proxies. They don't provide any explanatory value at all. There must be some underlying reason why any variations might be observed. So here, we might say, maybe we'll see variations in personality traits because there are cultural differences in how personality is expressed or whatever. Well, that suggests that it's not about the categorical membership in these groups per se. It's about really identifying as with these groups, that the identity component, not the categorical component, is what explains the variation, in which case then that should be measured and included in the models. And if that's right, then that should account for the variations in the group differences. You can take this a step further if you're interested in thinking about how the constructs are defined. So looking at, if the big five in this case does not generalize across groups, perhaps there are some psychological reasons that can explain that, and those can be built into the model. There's surprisingly little of this going on in the personality literature. And part of it goes back to this figure where we're just, as a field, not really engaging with linking characteristic adaptations in particular from culture to traits. And the more that we do that, the more we get to deeper understanding about culture, race, ethnicity, and how it's related to personality development. Okay, so what then? I'm really good at complaining about things and saying that things are terrible and that you should stop doing things, but what should we do? In my last minute, I'll just argue that none of this is actually that hard. The solutions here are actually pretty straightforward. I think sometimes it seems like when you think about diversifying, you think it seems like this insurmountable task would be too expensive, too difficult. But some of what we can do is just changing the way that we do the work we're already doing. So bringing a more cultural perspective to what we do. And I think Monisha's talk will pick up on this some more about, really thinking about all our work being cultural psychology, that all psychology is cultural psychology. And if you start doing that, then that really opens the doors to start thinking about who you might include, what perspectives you might include, and so on. So first, as I said, is just stop treating personality as the same as traits. You all know this is the case. So just act like it. When you're writing, when you're speaking, stop equating it. Editors out there, reviewers out there, don't allow this. It's one of my stock comments that I cut and paste whenever I review a paper. You cannot equate personality and traits. They're not the same thing. And doing so really diminishes sort of the nature of our field and what we can possibly understand in it. Two, just be clear on who is and who is not represented. Don't try to overgeneralize your findings and say, oh, we're addressing the diversity or the generalizability or the universality of some kind of finding because you have two cultures or two nations, I should say, represented. Really think about to whom are your results speaking and to whom are they not speaking. Again, not a very new or innovative idea, but one we still struggle with. And finally, with proxies, proxies are limited, but they're often all we have, especially with secondary data, which is very common in personality trait research. So I'm not saying don't use those proxies at all. I've used them plenty. You'll see plenty of my published work that includes just the proxies without the processes. But if you do that, then you have to use real caution in terms of interpreting those findings and not over-interpret, and be clear that what we really need to do, the next study on this topic should include those processes because the proxies just don't cut it. Okay, then, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you picked up one or two things that could be useful for you. Again, if you follow this OSF link, you will find the slides, the paper I referenced, and reference list, and a video of this talk. Thanks so much, and enjoy the rest of the talks in this symposium, and appreciate your attention. Bye-bye.